The silence in Hanem felt different tonight, thick with the kind of tension that made experienced servers move with extra care around table 12. Min Jae-sung sat alone at his usual corner booth, a man who commanded attention simply by existing in a space. His charcoal suit was cut with the precision of someone who understood that clothes were armor, and his stillness held the controlled energy of a predator at rest. The other diners stole glances at him, sensing power they couldn't name, while the staff moved in careful choreographed patterns that kept them respectful but distant. Zara Williams approached his table with the same steady confidence she brought to everything, her movements economical and purposeful. 6 months serving at this upscale Korean fusion restaurant had taught her to read the subtle hierarchies that played out in dining rooms, and she understood that the man at table 12 was different from the usual collection of tech executives and finance bros who frequented the place. There was something in the way his security detail positioned themselves throughout the restaurant, never obvious but always watching, that spoke to her trained eye. If you're watching this from somewhere that feels safe and ordinary, take a moment to appreciate that feeling, because sometimes the most dangerous moments arrive disguised as perfectly normal evenings. She refilled his water glass with precise movements, noting how his dark eyes tracked every person who entered the restaurant, cataloging threats with the automatic assessment of someone who had survived by never letting his guard down. His presence filled the space around him like heat radiating from a forge, making the air itself feel charged with possibility and danger. The attack came at exactly 9:47, when the dinner rush had settled into the comfortable murmur of satisfied customers and the kitchen had found its rhythm. The front door exploded inward with a sound like thunder, glass showering across the polished concrete floor as 5 men in black tactical gear poured through the entrance with military precision. Their movements were coordinated, practiced, the kind of assault that spoke to extensive planning and professional execution. Time dilated into crystalline clarity as chaos erupted throughout the dining room. Customers screamed and dove under tables while servers froze in terror, trays crashing to the floor in a symphony of breaking porcelain. The gunmen moved with deadly purpose toward table 12, their weapons raised and focused on a man who had become absolutely still, his hand hovering near his jacket in a gesture that promised swift retaliation. Zara's body moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory overriding 6 months of deliberate civilian ordinariness. The nearest gunman was 3 steps away when she struck, her serving tray becoming a weapon as she drove it into his temple with precisely calculated force. He dropped instantly, his weapon clattering across the floor as she flowed into the next movement, her training taking control with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The second attacker turned toward the unexpected threat just as her elbow connected with his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs in a strangled gasp. She stripped his weapon in a move that would have made her old sergeant proud, her hands remembering the weight and balance of military hardware, as if the intervening years had never happened. The other 3 men hesitated for a crucial second, their attention split between their primary target and this waitress who moved like death in a black uniform. Min Jae-sung watched the impossible unfold before him with the analytical calm of a man accustomed to violence. But what he witnessed defied every assumption he had made about the woman who had been serving him coffee and perfectly prepared bulgogi for months. She moved through the remaining attackers with lethal grace, her civilian facade stripped away to reveal something far more dangerous underneath. Each strike was precise, economical, designed to neutralize rather than grandstand. The entire engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. When the silence returned, it carried the weight of revelation and the metallic scent of spilled blood. 3 men lay unconscious on the restaurant floor, while 2 others had fled through the shattered entrance, leaving behind weapons and tactical gear in their haste to escape. Zara stood in the center of the destruction, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, her uniform torn but her stance still combat-ready. The other diners remained huddled under tables and behind overturned chairs, their eyes wide with shock and incomprehension. The security detail that was supposed to protect Min Jae-sung had been caught flat-foot by the speed and precision of the assault, arriving to find their principal safe and their job done by a woman whose background check had listed her previous employment as coffee shops and retail stores. Min Jae-sung rose slowly from his booth, his movements deliberate and predatory as he approached the woman who had just saved his life. His dark eyes held a new weight of assessment, studying her with the focused intensity of someone recalibrating everything he thought he knew. The controlled stillness that had made him dangerous now carried a different quality, the recognition of a fellow predator disguised in ordinary clothes. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered completely and immediately. Zara met his gaze without flinching, her own assessment running its course as she calculated new variables and potential consequences. The careful distance she had maintained for months collapsed in the space between them, replaced by the electric tension of two people who had just seen through each other's masks. Her hands still held the tactical awareness of someone ready for additional threats, but her expression revealed the conflict of someone whose carefully constructed new life had just exploded along with the restaurant's front door. The wail of approaching sirens filled the night air, growing louder as emergency responders converged on the scene. Police cars and ambulances painted the broken glass in red and blue light, while crime scene investigators began the methodical process of documenting violence and collecting evidence. The other patrons gave statements in shaking voices, describing the attack in fragments that captured their terror but missed the professional precision of what they had witnessed. But Min Jae-sung's attention remained fixed on the woman whose secret had just rewritten the rules of engagement between them. She had saved his life with skills that belonged to a completely different world than the one where she served Korean fusion cuisine to tech workers and financial executives. The question of who she really was hung between them like a loaded weapon, promising to transform everything that came after this moment. The ordinary evening had become the catalyst that would bind their fates together, though neither of them understood yet just how completely their lives had just changed. The broken glass scattered across the restaurant floor reflected the shattered assumptions of two people who were about to discover that the most dangerous secrets were the ones hidden behind the most normal facades. The police finished their interviews at 3 a.m, leaving behind crime scene tape and unanswered questions that would disappear into bureaucratic files by dawn. Min Jae-sung had used the intervening hours productively, his network of contacts working through the night to uncover the truth about the woman who had turned his assumptions inside out. What they discovered was far more interesting than he had anticipated. Zara Williams was not her real name. The woman who had served him coffee with steady hands and perfect composure was actually Zara Okafor, former staff sergeant in Army intelligence with a service record that had been buried so deep it took his best sources 6 hours to excavate. Specialized training in counterintelligence, tactical combat, and threat assessment. 3 tours in classified locations doing work that left gaps in her official record where dangerous truths lived in shadows. She had disappeared from military life 18 months ago under circumstances that his contacts described as complicated, which in their vocabulary meant someone had died and the paperwork had been handled quietly. The transition to civilian life appeared to have been bumpy, a series of short-term jobs in different cities that suggested someone running from something larger than career dissatisfaction. Min Jae-sung studied the classified photographs on his secure tablet, comparing the serious-faced soldier in dress uniform to the woman who had dismantled 5 armed men with the casual efficiency of someone folding laundry. The transformation was remarkable, but now that he knew what to look for, he could see the traces of her real self in the way she had moved through his restaurant for months, cataloging exits and assessing threats with the unconscious competence of someone trained to survive in hostile territory. By the time the sun rose over the city, he had made his decision. Zara Okafor was exactly what he needed, whether she knew it yet or not. She was waiting for him in the small apartment above a Korean grocery store in Koreatown, a space that reflected the careful anonymity of someone who had learned not to get too comfortable anywhere. The furniture was functional and temporary, nothing that couldn't be abandoned in 15 minutes if circumstances required rapid departure. She had changed from her torn uniform into dark jeans and a simple sweater that did nothing to disguise the alertness in her posture. "We need to have a conversation about your future," he said, settling into the single chair with a controlled grace that made every space feel like his personal territory. Zara stood by the window, her position chosen to provide clear sight lines to the street below and multiple exit routes if the meeting went poorly. She had been expecting this conversation since the moment their eyes met across the destroyed restaurant, recognizing the calculating intelligence of someone who never let useful resources slip away unexploited. "I don't have anything to say to you," she replied, though her tone suggested she understood the futility of the statement even as she made it. "Staff Sergeant Zara Okafor," he said quietly, watching her entire body tense at the sound of her real name spoken aloud after months of carefully constructed anonymity. 3 tours. Classified operations in places that don't officially exist. Decorated for valor under fire. Disappeared from military records 18 months ago under circumstances that required significant political influence to arrange quietly. The silence stretched between them like a wire under tension, filled with the weight of secrets and the recognition that her carefully built new life had just collapsed as thoroughly as the restaurant's front door. She turned from a window to face him directly, abandoning the pretense that this was a conversation between equals when he clearly held every tactical advantage. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone preparing for the worst possible outcome. "Your skills," he answered with the directness of someone who had learned that complex negotiations began with simple truths. "My business requires the kind of security expertise that you demonstrated last night. I'm offering you a position that would utilize your considerable talents in exchange for compensation and protection." "Protection from what?" she said, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "For the consequences of saving my life," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of certainty rather than threat. "The men who attacked the restaurant were professionals. They will have identified you by now, which means you have become a liability that requires elimination. You can disappear again, spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, or you can accept my offer of employment and the security that comes with it." The tactical assessment was brutal in its clarity. She had spent 18 months building a new identity, establishing herself as ordinary and unremarkable, only to destroy all of that work in 90 seconds of reflexive action. The moment she had moved to protect him, she had stepped back into a world where violence followed complex rules and debts were paid in blood. "I never asked for your protection," she said, but the words lacked conviction because they both understood that protection was no longer a matter of choice. "Nevertheless, you require it," he responded with the calm certainty of someone stating meteorological facts. "Your current situation is untenable. Within 72 hours, there will be additional attempts on your life. You can face them alone, or you can accept professional assistance." The sound of breaking glass from the street below punctuated his words with perfect timing. Zara moved to the window in a crouch, her training taking control as she assessed the threat developing 3 stories down. 2 men were moving through the Korean grocery store with the purposeful efficiency of professionals conducting a search, while a third remained positioned at the rear exit. The kind of coordinated approach that suggested extensive surveillance and careful planning. "Your 72-hour estimate was optimistic," she said quietly, her hands already moving to retrieve the emergency pack she kept hidden behind the bedroom closet. 18 months of civilian life had not diminished her ability to recognize imminent danger. "My car is parked in the alley behind the building," Min Jae-sung said, rising from the chair with fluid motion that suggested he had been preparing for this possibility since their conversation began. "My driver is professionally competent and the vehicle is appropriately armored. We can continue this discussion somewhere more secure." The alternative was facing 3 armed professionals with nothing but improvised weapons and the fading hope that 18 months of careful anonymity might still provide some protection. Zara grabbed her pack and moved toward the door, her decision made by tactical necessity rather than trust. Sometimes survival required accepting assistance from dangerous allies when the available enemies proved more immediately lethal. They descended the back stairs with the coordinated silence of two people who understood the mechanics of tactical movement, her covering the rear approach while he maintained communication with his security team through a discreet earpiece. The armored sedan that waited in the alley belonged to a different world than her carefully maintained ordinariness, its bulletproof glass and reinforced frame speaking to the kind of ongoing threat that required permanent vigilance. The compound that became her new reality sat behind high walls in the hills above the city, its architecture blending traditional Korean elements with modern security considerations in a way that managed to be both beautiful and forbidding. The main house sprawled across manicured grounds that provided clear fields of fire in all directions, while discrete cameras and sensors created overlapping zones of surveillance that would detect approaching threats long before they became immediate dangers. "This is where you will live," Min Jae-sung explained as they walked through spaces that felt more like a luxury hotel than a home. All marble surfaces and carefully chosen art that spoke to wealth accumulated through enterprises that operated outside conventional business models. "Your primary responsibility will be personal security, though your intelligence background suggests additional applications for your expertise." The suite of rooms he showed her was larger than her entire previous apartment, furnished with understated elegance that made her acutely aware of how completely her circumstances had changed. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided views of the city spreading below like a circuit board of lights, while the bathroom contained amenities that belonged in high-end hotels rather than staff quarters. "What are the terms of this employment?" she asked, because even in desperate circumstances, a soldier understood the importance of clear rules of engagement. "6-month renewable contract," he replied, his tone carrying the formality of someone conducting legitimate business negotiations. "Salary commensurate with your skills and experience. Full room and board provided. Personal safety guaranteed for the duration of your employment and a reasonable transition period afterward. And if I decide this arrangement isn't working for me," she said, testing the boundaries of her new cage even as she recognized its necessity, "then we discuss alternative arrangements," he answered. But something in his expression suggested that such discussions might prove more complex than simple resignation letters. "For now, however, your immediate safety is secured and your talents will be properly utilized rather than wasted serving coffee to people who cannot appreciate their true value." The sun set over the city as Zara unpacked her few possessions into drawers that were designed to hold much more extensive wardrobes, the symbolic transition from her old life complete even if the emotional adjustment would take considerably longer. Through her window, she could see the lights of a world where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, unaware that their safety depended on complex negotiations between dangerous individuals who operated according to rules they would never understand. What she had gained was security and purpose. What she had lost was the illusion that she could ever return to the simple anonymity she had worked so hard to build. The woman who had served Korean fusion cuisine to tech workers was gone forever, replaced by someone whose skills would be appreciated in entirely different ways by a man who understood the true value of expertly applied violence. The contract had been signed in actions rather than words, sealed by necessity and a recognition that some choices were made by circumstances rather than preferences. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the beginning of a professional relationship that promised to be far more complicated than either of them anticipated. But tonight she fell asleep behind walls designed to keep the dangerous world at a safe distance, guarded by someone who had made survival into an art form. 3 weeks in her new life, Zara had developed routines that made the impossible arrangement feel almost normal. She rose before dawn to run security sweeps of the compound, her morning circuits taking her through gardens where traditional Korean pavilions sat beside modern surveillance equipment like ancient spirits, keeping watch over contemporary dangers. The juxtaposition felt appropriate for a life that balanced old-world formality with cutting-edge threat assessment. Min Jae-sung conducted business with the methodical precision of someone who understood that empires were built through careful attention to details that others might consider mundane. She accompanied him to meetings in glass towers downtown, standing at tactical distances while he negotiated agreements that moved millions of dollars through legitimate enterprises. Her presence changed the dynamic of these encounters in ways that fascinated her professional curiosity. Men who might have tested his patience or pushed boundaries found themselves reassessing their approaches when they noticed the woman who watched everything with the focused attention of someone cataloging potential threats. His business associates assumed she was decorative, another symbol of his success, like the handmade suits and luxury vehicles. They were wrong in ways that would have surprised them. She was conducting real-time threat assessments, mapping exit routes, and developing contingency plans for scenarios that range from hostile takeovers to active shooter situations. The corporate conference rooms felt remarkably similar to the forward operating bases where she had once provided security for high-value targets, just with better coffee and more expensive furniture. The nightmares came without warning on a Tuesday night when rain drummed against the windows with the steady rhythm of automatic weapons fire. Zara found herself back in a compound half a world away, watching flames consume buildings while the sound of screaming mixed with the mechanical chatter of helicopters overhead. She woke in her secure bedroom, gasping for air, her body drenched in sweat and her hands reaching for weapons that lived in a different life. The gentle knock on her door came 20 minutes later, after she had managed to slow her breathing but not her heart rate. Min Jae-sung stood in the hallway, holding a traditional Korean tea service, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled in a way that made him seem unexpectedly human. He wore dark sleeve pants and a simple shirt that revealed how his controlled stillness extended even to his most private moments. "You were having difficulty sleeping," he said, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority she had grown accustomed to during daylight hours. "I thought you might appreciate some company and something warm to drink." The tea was chamomile blended with traditional Korean herbs she could not identify, served in delicate porcelain that felt absurdly fragile in her hands. They sat in the living area of her suite without speaking, the silence filled with an intimacy she had not expected from someone who specialized in maintaining careful distances. Rain continued its assault on the windows while she sipped tea that tasted like comfort and tried to reconcile this gentle stranger with the man who commanded criminal enterprises with ruthless efficiency. Military service leaves marks that civilian life cannot always heal, he said quietly, his own tea cooling untouched in his hands. Some experiences require acknowledgement rather than forgetting. She studied his profile in the dim light, noting the way his shoulders held tension even in moments of apparent relaxation. Something in his tone suggested personal familiarity with sleepless nights and memories that refused proper burial. The man who projected absolute control during business hours apparently understood the weight of experiences that civilian society preferred to ignore. "How do you know?" she asked, curious about what shadows might live behind his carefully maintained composure. "Everyone who survives difficult circumstances carries scars," he replied, deflecting her question with the smooth expertise of someone who had learned to reveal information strategically. "The important thing is ensuring those scars do not prevent us from recognizing when we have found something worth protecting." The following morning brought new appreciation for his tactical intelligence as she watched him navigate a complex negotiation with shipping executives who controlled access to critical transportation networks. His approach combined cultural courtesy with implied consequences in ways that achieved compliance without visible coercion. She found herself admiring the elegance of his methodology, recognizing artistry in his ability to project power through restraint rather than demonstration. After the meeting, she offered her first unsolicited professional opinion about his security protocols, suggesting modifications to his routine that would reduce predictability without compromising efficiency. He listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that expertise came in forms that transcended formal credentials. "Your assessment is accurate," he said as they walked toward his vehicle. "I have been following patterns that could be exploited by sufficiently motivated adversaries. Your recommendations will be implemented immediately." The acknowledgement felt like victory in ways she had not expected. Her military career had been built on competence and recognition of that competence by superiors who understood its value. Civilian life had offered neither challenge nor appreciation for skills that had no obvious application in ordinary circumstances. Working for Min Jae-sung provided both, along with the satisfaction of utilizing capabilities that had been dormant too long. Thursday afternoon brought unexpected insight into the man behind the reputation when he asked her to accompany him on what he described as a personal errand. The destination proved to be a modest assisted living facility in a quiet neighborhood where elderly Korean immigrants lived in comfortable dignity among people who shared their cultural reference points. The woman who greeted him in the common room was tiny and fierce, her eyes holding the same intelligent assessment that made him formidable in business negotiations. Aunt Min embraced him with the casual affection of someone who remembered him as a boy rather than a man capable of casual violence. She scolded him in rapid Korean about his infrequent visits before switching to accented English for Zara's benefit, her curiosity about his companion obvious despite her attempts at politeness. "This is Zara," he said, his formal tones softening in ways that revealed depths she had not suspected. "She provides professional assistance with security matters. She looks like she could handle herself in a fight," Aunt Min observed with the directness of someone who had survived too much history to waste time on diplomatic niceties. "Good. You need someone watching your back who is not afraid of getting blood on their hands." They spent 2 hours in the garden behind the facility, sharing Korean pastries while Aunt Min recounted stories from Min Jae-sung's childhood that painted pictures of a lonely boy who had learned self-reliance early and emotional distance as a survival mechanism. Zara watched him listen to these stories with patient affection, his usual controlled intensity replaced by genuine warmth that transformed his entire presence. The drive back to the compound was quiet, filled with the weight of revelations that changed the tactical assessment of their professional relationship. She had seen him demonstrate kindness without audience or agenda, revealing character depths that complicated her understanding of who he actually was beneath the reputation and the carefully maintained facade. That evening, they sparred in the compound's private gym, a routine that had developed naturally from her need to maintain physical conditioning and his recognition that combat training provided stress relief more effectively than conventional exercise. She had expected him to be competent, but was surprised by the elegance of his technique, movements that spoke to extensive training in martial arts that emphasized precision over brute force. Their training sessions had become spaces where professional distance could be safely reduced, the physical demands creating intimacy that would have been inappropriate in other contexts. She found herself noticing the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the controlled power in his hands, the focused intensity in his dark eyes as he calculated angles and responses. The awareness was mutual, she realized, catching him studying the lines of her body with appreciation that had nothing to do with tactical assessment. During a break between rounds, she challenged his decision to maintain such visible security protocols at public events, arguing that subtlety would provide better protection with lower profiles. Their discussion became an intellectual sparring match that revealed the strategic thinking behind his public persona and her growing confidence in offering contrary opinions. "You believe I should project less strength in order to appear as a smaller threat," he said, genuinely considering her perspective rather than dismissing it automatically. "I believe you should project different kinds of strength," she corrected, wiping sweat from her face with a towel that carried a scent of sandalwood and controlled intensity. "Fear works, but respect lasts longer and requires less maintenance." Their eyes met across the exercise mats, and for a moment, the careful professional distance they maintained dissolved completely. She saw recognition in his expression, acknowledgement that she understood complexities in a situation that few people bothered to analyze. He saw intelligence and tactical thinking that matched his own, packaged in a woman whose strength complemented rather than competed with his authority. The moment stretched between them like a wire under tension before he stepped back, restoring the safe distance that kept their relationship contained within acceptable parameters. But something had shifted permanently, an acknowledgement of mutual respect that would reshape all future interactions. Later that night, Zara stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the city lights, and acknowledged that her understanding of this arrangement was becoming more complex than she had anticipated. What had begun as a simple exchange of protection for expertise was developing layers that had nothing to do with professional necessities and everything to do with the recognition that she had found someone who appreciated capabilities that others had viewed as problematic or dangerous. Min Jae-sung was not the man she had expected when circumstances forced her into his employment. Beneath the reputation for ruthless efficiency lived someone who visited elderly aunts, brought tea to people suffering from nightmares, and listened to tactical advice from subordinates without defending his ego against superior insight. Someone who understood that strength took many forms and that the most effective power was the kind that never needed to prove itself through demonstration. The dangerous realization was that she was beginning to look forward to their interactions in ways that had nothing to do with job satisfaction and everything to do with the growing certainty that she had found someone who saw her completely and was not afraid of what he discovered. Someone whose own hidden depths invited exploration and whose careful control suggested passion that would be worth the risk of discovery. The intelligence came together like pieces of a puzzle Zara had been unconsciously assembling for weeks. Security footage from 3 different locations showed the same faces conducting surveillance. Financial records revealed shell companies moving money in patterns designed to fund extended operations, and communication intercepts suggested coordination between rival factions that should have been competing rather than collaborating. Someone was investing significant resources in a campaign against Min Jae-sung, and their patience was finally approaching its end. She spread the evidence across the conference table in his private office, organizing photographs and documents with the methodical precision of someone trained to build cases that would convince skeptical commanders. The pattern was clear to anyone who understood how professional operations developed over time, from initial reconnaissance through resource positioning to final execution. "This is the Huang organization," she said, indicating surveillance photos that showed familiar faces and locations they had no legitimate reason to occupy. "They have been mapping your routines for at least 6 weeks, probably longer. The shell companies trace back to accounts that fund their territorial expansion efforts." Min Jae-sung studied the materials with the focused concentration she had come to recognize as his processing mode, absorbing details and calculating implications with the speed of someone whose survival had always depended on accurate threat assessment. His expression remained controlled, but she could see tension building in the set of his shoulders and the careful stillness that preceded decisive action. "They want the shipping contracts," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood the motivations behind complex criminal enterprises. Control of the harbor facilities would give them leverage over half the legitimate businesses in the city. "They see my agreements with the Port Authority as obstacles to their expansion." The meeting with the port commissioners had been scheduled for weeks, a routine negotiation about container inspection protocols that would determine how efficiently cargo moved through facilities that generated millions in revenue every quarter. Under normal circumstances, it would have been conducted in a conference room with bulletproof glass and discreet security positioned at tactical intervals. But circumstances had stopped being normal the moment someone decided that Min Jae-sung's continued influence posed an unacceptable threat to their ambitions. Zara recommended postponing the meeting until they could develop better intelligence about the scope of the threat and the specific tactics likely to be employed. Her military experience suggested that patience was the better part of tactical wisdom when facing adversaries who had demonstrated extensive planning capabilities. But Min Jae-sung understood that showing weakness at critical moments invited escalation rather than deterrence. "Postponement signals vulnerability," he explained as they prepared to depart for the meeting. My business relationships depend on the perception that I honor commitments regardless of external pressures. Fear is a useful tool until it becomes obvious that you are the one experiencing it. The ambush came during the transition between the parking garage and the elevator bank, a tactical choice that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the building's security protocols and the timing of their arrival. Zara had been conducting continuous threat assessments since they entered the garage, her trained senses cataloging anomalies that included too few civilian vehicles, unusual positioning of maintenance equipment, and the absence of security personnel who should have been visible at key checkpoints. She moved the moment the first shooter appeared from behind a concrete pillar, her body positioning to shield Min Jae-sung while her hands went to the weapon concealed beneath her jacket. The garage erupted into chaos as multiple attackers revealed themselves from positions that had been carefully selected to create crossfires and eliminate escape routes. Professional work, she noted with clinical detachment as she returned fire with controlled precision. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly when her weapon jammed after the third shot, a mechanical failure that left her temporarily vulnerable at the moment when covering fire was most critical. She saw the flanking maneuver developing and knew that the next few seconds would determine whether they survived to continue this conversation or became casualties of someone else's territorial ambitions. Min Jae-sung moved with lethal efficiency, his own weapon appearing with the smooth speed of someone whose reflexes had been honed through necessity rather than training. He positioned himself to cover her vulnerability, laying down suppressing fire that forced the attackers to seek cover while she cleared the mechanical failure and restored her tactical capability. The role reversal lasted less than 30 seconds, but in that brief interval, she experienced what it felt like to be protected by someone whose competence matched her own. They fought their way to the stairwell with coordinated movements that spoke to an intuitive understanding of each other's tactical preferences, her aggressive advancement complementing his methodical covering fire in ways that maximize their effectiveness while minimizing exposure to hostile fire. By the time security reinforcements arrived, the immediate threat had been neutralized through a combination of superior position, accurate shooting, and tactical cooperation that had transformed a disadvantageous situation into a manageable problem. The safe house was a penthouse apartment in a building that Min Jae-sung owned through various corporate intermediaries, its luxury appointments designed to provide comfort during extended security operations. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, while bulletproof glass ensured that external threats remained external. The medical supplies were military-grade, designed for treating combat injuries rather than civilian accidents. Zara worked on the bullet graze across his shoulder with steady hands that belied the adrenaline still coursing through her system, cleaning the wound with antiseptic that made him hiss between clenched teeth. The injury was superficial but required attention to prevent infection, and the process of providing medical care created an intimacy that had nothing to do with their professional relationship and everything to do with the fundamental human need to tend those who had risked themselves for our protection. "You saved my life today," she said quietly, her fingers gentle against his skin as she applied antibiotic ointment to the cleaned wound. "When my weapon failed, you could have used the confusion to escape. Instead, you made yourself a target to keep me alive." Min Jae-sung sat still under her ministrations, but she could feel the tension in his muscles and the controlled breathing that suggested he was processing more than just physical discomfort. The careful distance he maintained during normal interactions had collapsed under the pressure of shared danger, revealing emotional complexity that his public persona was designed to conceal. "You have become important to my operation," he said, though his tone suggested the explanation was incomplete even as he offered it. She finished bandaging his shoulder and moved to the kitchen area to clean her own injuries, minor cuts from flying concrete that had drawn blood without causing serious damage. He followed her, and when she struggled to reach a particularly awkward angle on her back, he took the antiseptic-soaked cloth from her hands without asking permission. His touch was gentle despite the controlled strength in his fingers, careful attention to wounds that were painful rather than dangerous. The process reversed their earlier positions, making him the caregiver while she accepted assistance that required trust and vulnerability. The silence between them filled with awareness that had nothing to do with tactical cooperation and everything to do with the recognition that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession rather than conversation. The truth is that I have been alone for most of my adult life. My position requires isolation to maintain security and authority. People fear me or want to use me, but no one has ever seen me as someone worth protecting until you risked yourself to cover my retreat today. Zara turned to face him, noting the way his usual mask of controlled composure had slipped to reveal exhaustion and loneliness that made him seem unexpectedly human. She understood the corrosive effects of necessary isolation, the way that survival sometimes required cutting connections that might be used against you. Her own military service had taught similar lessons about the price of maintaining operational security. I left the military because I killed someone who deserved to live, she said, offering her own confession in exchange for his vulnerability. A young insurgent who could have been captured instead of eliminated. I had choices in that moment, and I chose the expedient option over the moral one. I have been running from the person that made me ever since. The admission hung between them like a bridge across dangerous waters, connecting wounds that civilian society preferred to ignore with understanding that came only from shared experience. They stood close enough to feel each other's breathing, close enough to notice the way emotional honesty had changed the quality of attention each paid to the other. "You are not the same person who made that choice," he said quietly, his hand rising to touch her face with surprising gentleness. 18 months of choosing mercy over expedience has created someone new, someone who risks herself to protect others instead of eliminating threats before they become problems. The space between them decreased until she could smell the sandalwood and controlled intensity that she had come to associate with his presence. His eyes held the question that neither of them was ready to answer directly. The recognition that their partnership had evolved beyond professional necessity into something more complex and potentially more dangerous than the threats they faced from external enemies. The moment stretched toward possibilities that would change everything when the secure communication device on the kitchen counter erupted into urgent alerts. Multiple security breaches at the main compound, coordinated assault teams approaching from different vectors. The kind of sophisticated operation that suggested their afternoon's work had been preliminary rather than decisive. The moment of personal connection shattered against the immediate reality of tactical demands that required their complete attention. They moved toward the equipment room with practiced efficiency, the intimate conversation abandoned in favor of operational planning that would determine whether they lived long enough to continue exploring what had begun to develop between them. But something fundamental had changed during those quiet moments of shared vulnerability, a recognition that they had found in each other something worth protecting that transcended professional arrangements and survival necessities. As Zara checked weapons and communication equipment, while Min Jae-sung coordinated with the security teams, she understood that they had passed a point of no return in their relationship. What had begun as mutual professional respect had evolved into personal investment in each other's welfare that would complicate every tactical decision going forward. She was no longer just his security consultant. She had become someone whose safety mattered to him for reasons that had nothing to do with operational effectiveness. The realization should have been concerning from a professional standpoint, but instead it filled her with a sense of completion she had not experienced since leaving military service. She had found someone who understood the weight of necessary violence, who appreciated competence without being threatened by it, and who was brave enough to show vulnerability in exchange for honest connection. Someone whose protection had become as important to her as her own survival. The dangerous truth was that she had stopped thinking about their arrangement as temporary employment and started thinking about it as the beginning of something permanent, something that would require both of them to risk more than their physical safety if they wanted to discover what lay beyond the careful professional distance they had maintained. Something worth fighting for rather than simply surviving. The photograph arrived at dawn, delivered by courier to the main gate with instructions that it reach Min Jae-sung immediately. The image showed Aunt Min sitting in what appeared to be a warehouse, her hands bound, but her expression defiant in ways that revealed where her nephew had inherited his refusal to show fear under pressure. The message accompanying the photograph was brief and professionally worded, outlining terms for her safe return that would require Min Jae-sung to appear alone at a location of their choosing within 12 hours. Zara studied the tactical implications while Min Jae-sung absorbed the emotional impact, her trained eye analyzing background details that might provide intelligence about the location, while he processed the reality that his enemies had chosen to escalate conflict by targeting the one person whose welfare mattered more to him than strategic advantages. His controlled fury was volcanic in its intensity, all the more dangerous for being contained within the disciplined restraint that had made him formidable in less personal confrontations. "This is obviously a trap," she said, stating what they both understood while her mind worked through potential response scenarios. "They want you in a vulnerable position where they can eliminate the threat you represent while demonstrating to other potential rivals what happens to those who interfere with their territorial expansion." Min Jae-sung stood at the window, overlooking the compound's defensive positions, his stillness carrying the weight of someone calculating costs that extended beyond mere tactical considerations. Aunt Min had raised him after his parents died, providing the only stable relationship in a childhood that had otherwise been shaped by violence and survival necessities. Her kidnapping transformed what had been business competition into something deeply personal, changing the rules of engagement in ways that made conventional tactical wisdom insufficient. "I will not abandon her to prove a point about operational security," he said quietly, his voice carrying finality that indicated the decision had already been made despite its obvious tactical weaknesses. Zara moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the controlled tension radiating from his body as he struggled between strategic logic and emotional commitment. She understood the impossible choice he faced, recognizing the psychological warfare inherent in forcing him to choose between personal loyalty and operational survival. His enemies had identified his one exploitable vulnerability and were using it with surgical precision. "You will not go alone," she said, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had made her own decision about acceptable risk levels. "This is exactly the kind of operation my training was designed to handle. Hostage rescue with minimal collateral damage while neutralizing threats that have demonstrated willingness to escalate beyond acceptable boundaries." The warehouse district where the exchange was scheduled contained dozens of potential locations, but Zara's analysis of the photograph had identified architectural details that narrowed their search to 3 possible buildings. Her reconnaissance confirmed which facility was being used for the operation, along with security arrangements that suggested professional planning but resource limitations that created exploitable weaknesses. The Huang organization had positioned snipers on adjacent rooftops and established vehicle checkpoints that would funnel any rescue attempt through predetermined kill zones, but their personnel deployment revealed gaps that could be exploited by someone with military experience in urban combat operations. They were prepared for a conventional assault or negotiation scenario, not for the kind of surgical precision that Zara's specialized training made possible. Her plan required Min Jae-sung to approach the primary entrance exactly as requested while she infiltrated from an unexpected vector, using industrial infrastructure to reach advantageous positions before the scheduled exchange time. Coordination would depend on precise timing and communication through encrypted channels that a security team had established for exactly this type of emergency situation. The greatest risk was that Aunt Min might be harmed during the confusion of a tactical rescue, but leaving her in hostile custody posed equal dangers with less control over the outcome. Professional kidnapping operations rarely concluded with the safe release of witnesses who could identify perpetrators, regardless of whether ransom demands were met according to agreed terms. Zara moved through the warehouse complex with the fluid silence of someone whose survival had once depended on remaining invisible while conducting reconnaissance in hostile territory. The industrial environment provided excellent concealment opportunities for someone trained to use shadows and structural elements as tactical advantages, while the enemy's focus on the primary entrance meant that secondary access points remained underguarded. She reached the designated position 15 minutes before the scheduled exchange, using that time to confirm Aunt Min's location and assess guard rotations that would determine optimal timing for coordinated action. The elderly woman appeared unharmed but alert, her body language suggesting someone who was prepared to take advantage of any opportunity for escape or resistance. Min Jae-sung's arrival at the front entrance created the expected distraction, drawing attention toward negotiations that were designed to fail while providing cover for tactical movements that the enemy would not anticipate until tactical superiority had already shifted. Zara used the audio confusion to neutralize perimeter security with efficiency that her old unit commanders would have recognized as textbook application of advanced urban warfare techniques. The assault phase lasted less than 4 minutes, overwhelming defensive positions through coordinated precision that eliminated threats faster than they could respond or adapt to changing tactical realities. Zara's movements flowed from position to position with deadly grace, each engagement calculated to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure to hostile fire from remaining enemy personnel. She reached Aunt Min during the height of the engagement, cutting restraints while providing covering fire that kept hostile personnel pinned behind inadequate concealment. The elderly woman moved with surprising agility toward the extraction route, her cooperation making the rescue operation significantly more manageable than tactical projections had suggested. The explosion came as they approached the final exit, a booby trap designed to eliminate witnesses regardless of the operation's tactical outcome. Zara saw the device, triggering, and knew that her position would absorb most of the blast force. But Min Jae-sung moved with reflexes that defied rational calculation, throwing himself between her and the explosion with absolute disregard for his own survival. The concussive force hurled them both against concrete walls with violence that transformed the warehouse in a chaos of falling debris and smoke that burned the eyes and lungs. Zara found herself pinned beneath structural wreckage, with Min Jae-sung's body shielding her from impacts that would have been fatal, his blood mixing with dust and concrete fragments in patterns that spoke to traumatic injury. She fought her way free of the debris with desperate strength, her hands finding his pulse while her eyes assessed damage that required immediate medical intervention to prevent becoming permanent loss. His breathing was shallow and irregular, consciousness flickering between awareness and the kind of emptiness that preceded more serious complications. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice cutting through the ringing in her ears as she applied pressure to wounds that were bleeding too freely to ignore. "You do not get to die after saving my life. That is not how this story ends." The emergency medical response was swift and professional, arriving within minutes to transport all 3 of them to a trauma facility that specialized in treating injuries that resulted from violence rather than accidents. Aunt Min's injuries were minor, mostly shock and exhaustion that would heal with rest and appropriate care. Min Jae-sung's condition required surgical intervention and careful monitoring to prevent complications that could prove fatal. Zara maintained vigil in the hospital waiting area, while surgeons worked to repair damage that included internal bleeding, fractured ribs, and a concussion that had resulted from his head striking concrete with near-lethal force. The hours stretched with mechanical slowness, filled with the antiseptic smell of medical facilities and the constant awareness that she might lose someone who had become essential to her sense of purpose and completion. When he finally regained consciousness, his first concern was for her welfare rather than his own condition, his eyes searching her face for signs of injury while his voice struggled to form words around medication and exhaustion. The role reversal was complete now, with her providing protection and comfort while he recovered from wounds sustained, protecting her from consequences he could have avoided by abandoning her to enemy action. "You saved my life," she said quietly, her hand covering his where it lay against the hospital blanket. "When you saw the explosion coming, You could have sought your own cover. Instead, you made yourself my shield. The truth was that watching him unconscious and bleeding had crystallized feelings she had been avoiding acknowledging even to herself. Somewhere between professional respect and tactical cooperation, she had fallen completely in love with a man whose protection had become more important to her than her own survival. Someone whose loss would have destroyed something essential in her that no amount of military training could have prepared her to handle. Min Jae-sung's recovery would take weeks, but the immediate crisis had passed and his vital signs had stabilized sufficiently to allow cautious optimism about long-term prognosis. Aunt Min insisted on remaining at the hospital to provide the kind of caring attention that medical professionals could not offer, her presence transforming his private room into a space that felt more like family recovery than clinical treatment. The Huang organization had been effectively neutralized through the combination of their warehouse operations failure and subsequent law enforcement attention that made continued territorial expansion impossible. Their leadership faced federal charges that would remove them from consideration as ongoing threats, while their remaining personnel had dispersed to avoid association with an operation that had attracted unwanted government scrutiny. But the real victory was more personal than tactical. Zara had discovered that love did not require the abandonment of strength or the acceptance of vulnerability without reciprocation. What had developed between them was partnership based on mutual recognition of each other's capabilities and unwavering commitment to each other's welfare that transcended professional arrangements or survival necessities. As she sat beside his hospital bed, watching him sleep with the peaceful expression of someone who no longer fought unconscious battles, she understood that their relationship had passed every test that circumstances could devise. They had proven their devotion through actions that risked everything for each other's safety, creating bonds that could not be broken by external threats or internal doubts. The dangerous realization was that she no longer wanted to imagine a future that did not include his presence as a permanent rather than temporary element. What had begun as forced proximity had evolved into chosen commitment, with both of them having demonstrated through their actions that they valued each other's lives above their own. The foundation for something permanent had been established through shared danger and mutual protection, creating possibilities that neither of them had anticipated when circumstances first brought them together. Tomorrow would bring new conversations about the future they wanted to build together. But tonight she was content to maintain watch over someone whose recovery represented the successful completion of the most important mission she had ever undertaken. The mission to protect not just his physical safety, but the possibility of love that had grown between them despite every reasonable obstacle that should have prevented its development. Recovery became a different kind of intimacy, measured in small victories and shared silences that held more meaning than the dramatic declarations of action movies. Zara maintained constant presence during Min Jae-sung's hospitalization, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed and learning to read the subtle changes in his breathing that indicated pain levels or the quality of his rest. The nursing staff had long since stopped questioning her authority to make decisions about his care, recognizing the devotion that transcended professional relationships. 3 weeks after the explosion, his mobility had progressed from assisted walking to careful independence, though the doctors insisted on additional observation before approving his discharge. The private room had been transformed into something resembling a temporary office, with Aunt Min bringing traditional Korean soups that filled the sterile space with the comfort of familiar scents, while secure communication devices allowed him to maintain oversight of business operations that required his personal attention. The conversation about their future began casually, as important discussions often did, during one of the quiet afternoon hours when hospital routines created space for reflection. Min Jae-sung was reviewing quarterly reports from his legitimate enterprises when he noticed Zara studying legal documents that outlined the terms of her employment contract, her expression thoughtful in ways that suggested she was calculating implications beyond mere technical compliance. "Your 6-month agreement expires next week," he observed, though his tone suggested awareness that the approaching deadline represented far more than administrative convenience. with the immediate threats neutralized and your safety no longer requiring protective custody. You are free to make whatever choices serve your best interests. Zara set aside the contract documents and moved to the window, looking out over the city where ordinary people lived ordinary lives without consideration of the complex negotiations that ensured their continued safety. Her military training had prepared her for tactical decisions made under pressure, but civilian life required different kinds of courage when confronting choices that would determine the shape of permanent rather than temporary arrangements. I have been thinking about what I want my life to look like, she said quietly, her back still turned toward him in a way that suggested vulnerability beneath her outward composure. 6 months ago, I was running from violence and trying to convince myself that normal was something I could learn to want. But normal feels like pretending to be someone I am not. The truth was that their arrangement had revealed capabilities and satisfactions she had not experienced since leaving military service. Working alongside Min Jae-sung had provided intellectual challenges that utilized her strategic thinking, physical demands that maintained her tactical edge, and professional recognition that acknowledged the full scope of her competence rather than requiring her to minimize her abilities to fit civilian expectations. More than that, she had discovered the peace that came from partnership with someone whose strength complemented rather than competed with her own. Someone who appreciated her capabilities without being threatened by them, who offered protection when circumstances required it, but also accepted her protection when roles were reversed. Someone whose presence had become essential to her sense of completion in ways she had not thought possible. Min Jae-sung listened to her processing with the patient attention of someone who understood that important decisions required time and space rather than pressure or persuasion. His own calculations had been completed weeks ago, during those first desperate hours when her life hung in the balance, and he realized that losing her would destroy something essential in himself that could never be recovered or replaced. "I have a proposition," he said when her silence indicated readiness to hear alternatives to the binary choice between staying and leaving. "My legitimate business operations are expanding into areas that require sophisticated security management and strategic planning. I am offering you a position as head of security and tactical operations, with full partnership in decision-making and profit-sharing that reflects your contributions rather than treating you as an employee." The offer represented more than professional advancement. It was recognition that what had developed between them transcended the temporary arrangement that circumstances had initially required. Partnership implied equality, shared authority in domains where her expertise exceeded his own, and the kind of permanent commitment that civilian life rarely offered to people whose skills belonged to more dangerous applications. "You are offering me a life where I do not have to pretend to be less than I am," she said, understanding the full implications of his proposal and what it meant about his own willingness to share control with someone whose capabilities match his own. "I am offering you a life where being exactly who you are is not just acceptable, but essential," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had thought carefully about what he was proposing and what it would require from both of them. The space between them decreased as she moved from the window to stand beside his bed, close enough to see the sincerity in his eyes and the careful hope he was trying not to reveal too obviously. What had begun as mutual professional respect had evolved into something far more complex and infinitely more valuable, a recognition that they had found in each other something worth building a permanent future around. "The contract that brought us together is officially completed," she said, taking his hand in hers and feeling the controlled strength that had protected her life at the cost of his own safety. "But I choose to stay, not because circumstances require it, but because I have found something here that I never expected to discover. Someone whose partnership makes me stronger rather than requiring me to diminish myself." His fingers tightened around hers, and she could see the relief and satisfaction in his expression as he absorbed her decision and what it meant about their shared future. The dangerous isolation that had protected him from emotional vulnerability for most of his adult life was ending, replaced by chosen connection with someone who understood the weight of necessary violence and the value of carefully maintained control. That evening, They held a private ceremony in the hospital room with Aunt Min as their only witness, exchanging commitments that acknowledged the transformation of their relationship from professional arrangement to permanent partnership. The vows they spoke were practical rather than romantic, promising mutual protection, shared decision-making, and loyalty that would survive whatever challenges their unusual life might present. But the practical language could not disguise the profound emotional significance of what they were creating together. Two people who had been shaped by violence and loss had found in each other the possibility of building something that honored their strengths rather than requiring them to abandon the capabilities that made them formidable. Partnership that enhanced rather than compromised their individual power. 6 months later, their shared office overlooked the expanded shipping facilities that now generated legitimate revenue sufficient to fund their lifestyle without requiring involvement in enterprises that operated outside legal boundaries. Zara's strategic recommendations had streamlined operations while her security protocols had eliminated the vulnerabilities that rivals might have exploited to challenge their growing influence in international trade. She wore a platinum ring that matched his own, simple bands that signified commitment without ostentation, chosen for durability rather than display. Their marriage had been registered quietly in a civil ceremony that acknowledged legal reality without requiring public celebration. Though Aunt Min had insisted on a traditional Korean feast afterward that honored cultural requirements while maintaining the privacy they both preferred. The morning routine that had once been shaped by threat assessment and tactical preparation had evolved into something more balanced, though no less purposeful. They began each day with coffee in their private garden, reviewing intelligence reports and business projections while enjoying the peaceful moments before the demands of running complex operations claimed their attention. Their partnership extended to every aspect of their shared life, with decisions made through consultation that respected both his business expertise and her tactical insights. The power dynamic that had once been defined by his resources and her skills had transformed into something more sophisticated, with authority distributed according to competence rather than traditional hierarchies. What we have built together is stronger than what either of us could have achieved alone, Min Jae-sung said during one of their quiet morning conversations, his hand covering hers where it rested on the table between their coffee cups. Zara smiled, understanding that he was acknowledging not just their professional success, but the personal satisfaction they had both discovered in choosing partnership over the isolation that had once seemed like their only option. They had created a life that honored the truth of who they were rather than requiring them to pretend to be people they could never authentically become. The city spread below their hilltop compound, millions of people living lives that intersected with their operations in ways that created security and prosperity for more individuals than would ever know their names. The legitimate power they exercised together was more sustainable and ultimately more satisfying than the kind that depended on fear or coercion, built on competence and mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. As they prepared to face another day of complex negotiations and strategic planning, Zara reflected on how completely her life had been transformed from the evening when 5 gunmen had shattered the illusion that she could ever return to ordinary civilian existence. What had seemed like catastrophic exposure had become the foundation for building something extraordinary with someone who appreciated her strength rather than being threatened by it. The dangerous truth was that she had never been happier or more fulfilled than in this life they had created together, using their combined capabilities to build something that served their deepest needs while contributing to a larger good. They had found love through partnership, security through mutual protection, and purpose through shared commitment to excellence in everything they chose to undertake. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities that neither could have imagined when circumstances first forced them together, but which now seemed as inevitable as the sunrise that painted their garden in shades of gold and promise. They had claimed each other completely, two people who had discovered that the most dangerous thing was not the violence that others might bring against them, but the risk of loving someone deeply enough to make their welfare more important than personal safety. It was a risk they had both chosen willingly, and a choice that had transformed them from two isolated individuals into something stronger and more complete than the sum of their separate capabilities. The claiming was mutual and absolute, sealed by actions rather than words, and secured by the daily choice to build their shared future on the foundation of unwavering commitment to each other's dreams as well as their safety.